a lot of when we intellectualize, what we tend to learn, what folks tend to take on is it's not safe to feel these things in my body, right? I have to distance it. So part of the role of therapy too is providing a space where folks can experience those emotions and realize that they're not dangerous, that they can tolerate them.
The Chronic Illness Therapist podcast is meant to be a place where people with chronic illnesses can come to feel heard, seen, and safe while listening to mental health therapists and other medical professionals talk about the realities of treating difficult conditions. This might be a new concept for you, one in which you never have to worry about someone inferring that it's all in your head. We dive deep into the human side of treating complex medical conditions and help you find professionals that leave you feeling hopeful for the future. I hope you love what you learned here, and please consider leaving a review or sharing this podcast with someone you love. This podcast is meant for educational purposes only. For specific questions related to your unique circumstances, please contact a licensed medical professional in your state of residence. I recorded this episode in September of 2024, and I think this week is a perfect time to air this episode, given that we are talking a lot about the intersectional identities of living with chronic pain and chronic illness, and also what it's like to be isolated in this society due to other marginalized identities. Specifically in this episode, we're talking about LGBTQ. We might be silenced in government websites and government institutions and schools and all of that, but we won't be silenced here. And I hope that this episode brings you a sense of normalcy and peace amidst really difficult times.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Samantha Always. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and the director of social responsibility and inclusion at Room to Breathe Psychotherapy and Yoga, which is a psychotherapy practice integrated with the yoga studio, really focusing on the mind-body connection and somatic awareness. Before I worked at Room to Breathe as a clinician and supervisor, I worked in refugee resettlement in a community mental health practice. And that's where I became really interested in body awareness and alternative therapeutic modalities aside from talk therapy. That's actually how I found Room to Breathe. I took our yoga teacher training because I was really interested in strengthening nonverbal processing through trauma. And that is how I heard that there was a private practice. And long story short, I ended up here.
Amazing. Were you a therapist first, a mental health therapist first? Or did that yoga journey bring you into being a therapist?
Yeah, really good question. I was a mental health therapist first. I found yoga for myself as a form of stress management. And then through my work, which is primarily with interpreters, working with non-Western populations, I started to think a lot, especially for survivors of trauma who disproportionately experience chronic illness and chronic pain and impact on the body. How do we speak to the body and work with the body instead of just working with the mind? Both is really important. And when you're working with interpreters, ways around language and the limitations of cross-cultural dialogue became really important to me. So that's how I found the teacher training.
Amazing. Thank you. Nikki, I'd love to hear, your introduction and yeah.
Yeah, my name is Nikki Cologne. I'm a licensed social worker, also at Room to Breathe Psychotherapy and Yoga. My pronouns are she, they. And yeah, my work centers marginalized identities, specifically chronically ill, disabled folks, but also queer, trans and gender nonconforming, poly and kinky folks, and the intersections of all of the above. I too am really passionate about the mind body connection. Before I was a therapist, I was actually a body worker and a clinical massage therapist. So I had a similar journey finding Room to Breathe as Samantha, just really specifically looking for places that centered my body connection, um, prioritize somatic work so I could have a place to incorporate a more embodied approach into my therapeutic practice. Just that's what feels most authentic to me.
Massage therapy fascinates me so much. Just like working with the body in that way. And yoga, of course, too, like being able to move your body in different ways. But I would love to hear from you both. Tell me a little bit about the physical work, especially so in our society, we separate the two, and we know that they're not separate, but we do talk about it separately. Can you talk to me as if you are not separating the two? Tell me what this work looks like. Um, and it's okay if you do separate it because our language just brings us there. But then how does it look to, massage therapy? Can you tell me about like what you learned in that helps you through your work clinically now? I'm really not phrasing this question really well. I feel like there's like an artful answer here that I just feel like we would be able to draw better than say. But do you guys have any thoughts or ideas from what I'm asking, or should I continue to clarify?
Few things that are coming up. I think back to like, so for example, when I was a massage therapist, I actually would incorporate like bits of mindful practice, especially when I was doing more nurturing, like connective work, like prenatal, for example. I would incorporate a lot of like with consent, I would get permission to place hands on belly and like lead through sort of a meditation that would connect like mom to baby, things like that. Um, that is just always felt authentic to my work. And so I think similarly in the therapy space, I bring in a lot of like act, emotion, exposure. And so, when people are really deep in their cognitions, really running through with what's going on in the mind, I pause people a lot to ask like, okay, what is showing up in your body right now while you share that with me? What are we noticing? What are the sensations? What are you feeling? Um, just to bridge that gap, that perceived gap. Obviously, there's no gap, but that perceived gap, this perceived duality, bringing it back into focus.
Yeah.
Yeah, the work I've done with folks who have chronic pain. I was actually just talking with Nikki about this. I ran a chronic pain support group. And one of the things that's really tricky about chronic pain is that it often originates from an injury, right? That's where the pain first starts. But then when it becomes chronic, it often isn't because you're doing any harm to that part of the body or that injury is getting exacerbated, but it is a signal from the brain. You get kind of like a trauma response where the brain and body are working together to try to protect that part of the body. And a lot of people do a lot of physical therapy to try to address it. They're going doctor to doctor. And so it's one of these really tricky conversations because we do this separation of telling people that it does likely originate neurologically. It still manifests in these pain receptors between brain and body. But what I get a lot from people is this is all in your brain. You're telling me this is all in my mind. You're telling me that I'm crazy, that I'm losing it. And so having a really nuanced conversation, and Nikki and I were talking about the value of group work for folks who experience chronic pain and chronic illness, which we'll definitely talk about in fostering community, but also in be able to talk through some of the automatic responses that can come up. And I have a couple of folks who are experiencing chronic pain who are now doing the work of actually like getting to the origin of the pain through rewiring these neural pathways. We're experiencing so much more freedom, but it can be a really tricky conversation because of the separation that you're talking about, Destiny.
I love all that. Thank you so much. Yes. And can you, either of you, answer why it's so hard to explore these issues cognitively? Why do we what is moving us into somatics? What does make the body work so powerful? But can we talk a little bit about why it's first, like why it's so hard to work with it just cognitively, the way that our traditionally therapy has been?
Mm. I don't know if this is like an official answer, but something that I talk a lot about with my clients is that like no one is out here teaching us how to feel. It's not like we're being taught an emotional vocabulary in school. It's not like they're teaching us emotional literacy or like how to communicate emotions to each other. And I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but that seems to be a really common struggle, at least in my practice, where like people often just don't have even like a basic emotional vocabulary to explain. And of course, if we don't have the words to explain how we're feeling, like, obviously that's really difficult to convey how we're feeling. If we don't understand the difference between anxiety and excitement, like they feel really similarly in the body. I think there's a reason why movies like Inside Out are so popular because like that is giving kids a framework. I haven't even seen Inside Out, by the way, but I hear people talking about it a lot that like it is actually giving a framework to kids. And despite that we would all be better off for it, right? If we were being taught these things in school, we're just not. Um, so I get the sense that it's like a broader societal feeling.
Yeah, yeah, it's such a good point, Nikki. I also think because Nikki and I really center our work in working with folks with chronic illness and specifically within like other folks in the queer community, there's also something about being socialized out of safety with your body, safety around sex and sexuality, gender identity, ways in which our connection to our body, and I talk about this a lot with folks, gets disrupted through trauma. And this could be structural issues, this could be direct family trauma, right? And so building that connection becomes the way of building relationship with all of you. And the folks that tend to track into therapy tend to be verbal processors and intellectualizers. So they love to live up here. And I think part of the reason why we tend to go that way is because we want to make sense of it first. But if we just make sense of it, but we don't feel the impact of what that means, then we're just kind of sitting in this place where we're fully disconnected from a huge part of us, right? Our bodies felt the trauma too. And so it's like I always say the way out is in, and in includes the body too, not just the thoughts we have about what happened to us.
It's so interesting how we really are like we're in very intellectualized society. It's all cognitive. We do all live above the neck, but yet we do have such a limited vocabulary, like you said, Nikki. It's so I don't know, just never thought about that before.
I use the feelings wheel a lot. It's like a running joke with so many of my clients, like, oh, I said good. I said fine. The wheel's coming because I don't know how to describe how I'm feeling. And I'm like, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But this beautiful thing happens over time that like the wheel needs to come out less and less, right? Like we can learn this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sorry, one other thing too to add is a lot of when we intellectualize, what we tend to learn, when folks tend to take on is it's not safe to feel these things in my body, right? I have to distance it. So part of the role of therapy too is providing a space where folks can experience those emotions and realize that they're not dangerous, that they can tolerate them. And then also the body stops having to engage in these compensatory strategies and like these compensatory behaviors to try to distance from the emotion, like substance use, other forms of numbing from. And that's so profound that I work with folks who regularly engage in substance use. And as they develop awareness and capacity to sit in their emotions, they just naturally turn to it less and less. It's not everyone, like this isn't a universal, but I think like that communicates that safety piece and that we have to feel safe within also to feel safe outside of ourselves.
Yeah. That absolutely. I find that too. Because substances numb the physical sensations, right? And so if we learned that we can tolerate them, then we don't have to numb them anymore. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Good. I love this. So you guys started to talk a little bit about value of group work, um, fostering community and like why they're so powerful and what someone can learn in group that maybe they can't or is hard to learn in individual therapy.
Yeah, I think the shared experience piece, well, okay, I'm making an assumption here because I'm a chronically ill disabled group facilitator. I realize not everyone who facilitates a group would be shared experience. So I can only speak to my experience, but running the groups has just like deepened this understanding of how powerful shared experience is. I think, both as someone who lives with chronic illness myself, but also for my group members. It's just a different kind of connection. I think that can only come from like truly understanding what it's like. And as chronically ill folks who just have this pervasive pattern of invalidation from sadly medical providers, right? If you don't have a lot of peers in your life who are also chronically ill, it can feel like you're out on an island and you can be in therapy. You can even be in therapy with a chronically ill therapist, but I still think one on one is just different from being in a room with like 8, 9, 10, 11 other people who are sharing similar anecdotes and similar traumas and similar experiences of dismissal and disregard. And it's just like, it's a really beautiful thing when we can even get to the point where we can laugh about it because obviously it's a horrible thing. It's horrible that it's not surprising. But the beauty and the healing is that when you're in a room with 10 other people for whom this is also happening, it's like, well, we can laugh about it. We're all in this together. So yeah, I've just found it to be, I feel like the groups instill hope in a really different way. And I don't mean that to sound like we can't instill hope as individual therapists, but what I witness in the groups is magical. Like it's my favorite, I run two. So it's my favorite 2 75-minute blocks of time each week because it's just magical to watch people feel seen and understood and like, wow, this is happening to you too. This isn't just me. It's just different.
And it's
It's
so
it's
much,
different.
yeah, easier to see that when you're like you see it with your own eyes, you feel it in the room, whereas with one-on-one, it's like your therapist can tell you. I can even share my own stuff with you to help you understand that you're not alone, but it's still so different than when a group of your peers are sharing the same thing. And then through that, you realize so many things. You're not crazy, you're not making it up, you're not like y- just because the people over here don't understand doesn't mean nobody understands you. Yeah.
Yeah, I would also add the ideating and problem solving that folks engage in space together. When I ran my group for folks experiencing chronic pain, people would come with challenges that they were facing in the medical realm, and we would work together. And it got to a point where really I was sitting back and folks were taking the lead and supporting one another, not just invalidating in the validating of their experience, but also in thinking about how do you self advocate? What is the role? When do you know when it's important to find a new provider? And the ideas that folks had were also so rich for me. It's something I hadn't thought of in my own journey. And so I also just think you have so much more of an expansive body of knowledge for folks who are doing this work. There isn't a playbook, right? There's no one way to be chronically ill. There's no one way to experience chronic pain. And there's no one experience that you're going to have in the medical system. But we do know these things tend to happen, that you experience some form of medical gaslighting, that you could experience burnout around the difficulty of navigating the system, and having people who can just not just listen, but problem solve from a perspective of having experienced that. That's just like a richness like I've never seen.
That's so true. Yes, I completely agree. Do y'all do body-based work in groups, or does it tend to be a lot more of the talking only because that is so powerful with the resonating and hearing that other people have the same experiences.
Yeah, I became really interested in how to adapt or utilize Hanna Somatics, which is it's focused on movement patterns that folks engage in when they experience chronic pain, that are like holding patterns or a trauma in their body. And it's kind of leaning into those movement patterns and then releasing them. Typically, has how I had experienced it was always on a yoga mat on the ground. But I wanted to be really thoughtful because a lot of my folks were experiencing pretty significant back pain and talked about actually feeling more comfortable being seated than having to get all the way down on the ground. And so I focused a lot on how do I incorporate or utilize these movement practices and adapt it for the chair, which was a great practice for me professionally. And I would engage in that for about 15, 20 minutes at the end of every group session. And folks had the great thing about somatics is it is really gentle and you actually can just visualize it to be doing the practice. So there's no need to have to do every movement to feel the benefits of it. Yeah, and it was really, really helpful for some folks.
What are some of the benefits you've noticed that have been, like, almost instantaneous versus maybe benefits that were, like, after, like, a few sessions or days, weeks, months after someone's has done this work?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say the instantaneous piece oftentimes was that they noticed a part of their body that they hadn't been paying attention to before. A lot of the work with chronic pain from my experience or my perspective is also helping folks notice other parts of their body because the brain actually like changes when we experience chronic pain and that part, if you have someone map out the parts of their body, they'll actually map out that part as disproportionately larger because of the impact that it has on the brain and honestly our consciousness and our awareness. So just noticing different parts of the body. And then I would say over time, it's really developing the capacity to notice where they're holding and where the release is happening, and maybe where they're compensating in their movement patterns and giving them then the power to correct and maybe like see where the source of their chronic pain might be coming from those unconscious holding patterns as a result of physical or emotional trauma.
Yeah, when you mentioned going I can't remember how you said it exactly, but going into the pain, is that right?
Yeah, in some ways it's getting to the going in and getting to the source of the pain instead of trying to avoid the pain
Yeah.
too. Yeah.
It also reminded me of a little bit of progressive muscle relaxation, the way that you described, like, leaning in and then you can let go. Can you speak a little bit more to, like, this whole mechanism?
Sure, yeah. It's kind of the idea that there are specific movement patterns, and I don't want to misspeak. It's been a while since I've looked at the more official text, but that we tend to engage in these protective patterns. Really simplified, it's kind of curling in as a protective stance, then leaning to one side or the other, or kind of having a hyperextension in the back. So it's focused on these very specific movement patterns in the body, but there's a similarity to progressive muscle relaxation, certainly, in that it's bringing attention to the parts that you're holding by actually emphasizing that movement. Hanna Somatics just has very specific movement patterns that they utilize based on that information or that body of knowledge.
That makes perfect sense. Nikki, what's coming up for you around some of this?
Um, I I'm just so fascinated. We have a class actually at Room to Breathe that is this style of somatics that regrettably I've not taken in a little while, but I used to make sure to take it every week. And it's just, I don't know, it's just really profound. So I just really appreciate that Samantha was able to incorporate that in, a shorter format in the space. The way that I'm approaching it is obviously a little bit different again, because I'm not a certified yoga instructor, but um I will sort of pair my exercises that day based on like whatever the topic is. So let's say our topic is internalized ableism or medical gaslighting. I might start out the mindfulness component where I prompt folks to think about a specific time where, you know, they experience medical gaslighting, deliberately prompting some of those feelings that came up. Um, to practice distress tolerance, to practice sitting with these emotions, but then incorporating the movement to find a different way to sort of process what's showing up. And everything I offer is just a suggestion. I'll offer like a series of things. I'll always make it really clear that if what the body is craving is stillness, to honor that is okay. I do always make sure to say what Samantha already shared about like just visualizing it is enough. So like if you do want to take stillness, you can imagine the prompts that I'm giving. Um, but yeah, really trying to emphasize that like we store these emotions in our body and we can move through them. And yeah, I devote 15 to 20 minutes each group, but I usually start the group with the exercise where Samantha would end.
The other thing that's coming up for me as you both are explaining this process is that I don't know the exact number, but it's like something like 80 or 90% of the thoughts that we have per day are repetitive. And I imagine a lot of our body movements are too. I know mine are. Um, and so that sounds like this is really a lot of practicing, moving differently, bringing attention. You have to know what you're doing on repeat before you can change it. Um, Maybe not cognitively, but even somatically, like leaning into this, you might realize, wait, yeah, I do hold myself this way. And then learning to how to change that with compassion. Compassion, I'm sure, is at the heart of y'all's work too. Um, People are so confused as to why that's so important. But if you're trying to change something, but you're like, oh, you messed up again, oh, you did it again, oh, like then it really just puts on our defense patterns again.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about the connection with what we had talked about a little bit earlier of the way that we start to fear our emotions or are socialized out of, this is what I tend to say, socialized out of connection to our emotions or to certain emotions. We start to fear the pain and believe that we cannot tolerate it, and that tends to be reinforced when we try to engage in different movement patterns to avoid the pain, right? And so part of it is also learning that your body is not in danger, that yes, these are signals, but it's not signaling that you're hurting anything or harming anything. It's leftover ostensibly from a prior injury, and your brain is trying to protect you and your body is trying to protect you. And that's one thing I love to talk about is how adaptive and how supportive these responses are, and what we can do when they're no longer serving us in the space that we are now, but understanding why they came to be in the first place is also part of that self-compassion, self-acceptance. Nikki, is there anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, I'm thinking too about how we have to have internal awareness if we want to have any sense of like pacing and allocating our spoons. And, this is something we talk a lot about in my group where like a lot of folks are coming to the space often dissociating, right? Like being deliberately disconnected from the body because they don't want to feel the pain, because they don't want to think about the illness. And so these questions do often come up around like, well, why? Like this mindfulness exercise is not pleasant because if anything, I'm just more aware of the pain that I was not aware of before. And I'm like, yes, that's true. There is often this misconception around mindfulness that it's like this pleasant Zen like relaxing experience, but we're really trying to strengthen interoception in here. And the reason we're trying to do that is because if you have an internal awareness, you're going to be able to listen to your body's cues for pacing. You're going to be able to have a better understanding of like if you only have one spoon left and it's like 3 o'clock and you got a lot more day to go, you know? And, practicing tolerating distress. Like we all can handle so much more than we give ourselves credit for. So yeah, I think some psychoeducation even just around like what mindfulness even is, what the point of all of this movement and this mindfulness even is, because it's not necessarily for relaxation. It can be a beautiful byproduct of it, but like, yeah, like really getting people on board with this idea that we're going to spend 15 to 20 minutes to doing something that you might actually hate. But,
Totally.
10 weeks in, 12 weeks in, 16 weeks in, I do start to get some feedback around like, okay, I'm understanding.
Yeah, there's such a fight because the body already knows, I think, that it is going to be uncomfortable. And again, it's just trying to protect you. So it puts up that fight so quickly and so strongly. But that's where the therapeutic relationship is so important, because if they trust us, then we can work and trust is, I mean, trust is built in so many different ways. It's not just our own like, oh, we have the same lived experience, or we are a therapist, so therefore you trust us. Like, no, it's, do you feel heard? Do you feel seen? Do you feel validated and also like appropriately challenged? Because also nobody, even if they think they do, nobody really likes to just be like this like, yes, everything you say is completely right. We like challenge. We like to have thoughtful, like engaging conversation. And so um yeah, I think that that's all of that is important. When we're trying to build trust with clients, when clients are trying to, when listeners, like when you're trying to figure out, do I trust my therapist? Like, yes, I trust them to not do harm, but do I trust them to like be able to hold this space with me? I think those are some of the things that come up for me. Is there anything else that comes up for you?
Yeah. I think you bring up a really important point that Nikki and I have spent a lot of time talking about. And we were thinking about preparing for the podcast today. We were thinking about what is it that we would want prospective clients to know when they're looking for a therapist. And also, what would we want therapists to know when they're thinking about working with someone who is chronically ill and who has intersectional identities, right? Who is chronically ill and in a fat body, who is chronically ill and queer, right? And I think one of the things that Nikki and I talk a lot about is components of informed consent. And I'm sure Nikki can elaborate on this really well, but it's having really purposeful conversations and really honest conversations for someone who is a chronically ill clinician. I always encourage them to have open conversations about their own limitations, in part so it gives us permission when we need to care for ourselves to step away to be human and to take care of ourselves. And also, from my perspective, it gives the clients the ability to opt into working with someone who's chronically ill, because it means that there will be times for me where I will be in the hospital and I won't be able to attend sessions. And that can happen when I have flare ups really quickly. And if folks want or feel like they need a therapist who's always on call, that's not going to be me. I always say, my health is the most important thing because I cannot do this work if I do not have it. And so that's always going to be the thing that takes precedence for me. And on the other side, I think it's really important for clinicians to be having conversations with folks intentionally about what accommodations would they benefit from. And so if you're doing in-person work, this needs to look like COVID precautions. What COVID precautions are folks taking? And also what accommodations you have, what accessibility is there to get into your building, what accommodations you have for virtual spaces, how accessible is your virtual world. We found certain platforms to be more accessible for folks versus less. And I would argue that this should be conversation that the therapist is starting off, that the therapist is initiating. And this can also be conversation that the client starts off if the clinician is not taking the lead, just to make sure that they're going to have any level of safety in the space. I'll pause. Nikki, I'm sure you have some stuff to add.
Yeah, I was trying to even think about where to start because everything that you put out was Maybe I'll speak to the informed consent piece first. Yeah, and I think Samantha and I have worked together a lot to like really hone in like on how we are both doing this. And we talk about it in our group supervision as well, such that like even when we're not talking about disability, it's become a conversation around like, oh wow, there are so many things that I could be naming in informed consent to make sure that like people really understand what they're agreeing to, even outside of a disability context. But yeah, I mean, just adding on to what Samantha has already shared, because I share similar things, but I named too. Some of the realities of working with a disabled clinician, like there may be days where, I come into the space flaring. Like maybe it's not so bad I need to take the day off, but it might be a high pain day. I might be hooked up to my TENS unit. I might have an ice pack. I might need to periodically pause my camera because, like today, I have a disc bulge flare up and I sitting's hard and I need to stand. I name like there may be days that I can show up cognitively, but I'm having a migraine flare up or a vertigo flare up, and I might need to be off camera. And if I can, I'll always offer a rescheduling option if it's available, if that feels disruptive. And maybe this is because of the population that I work with. So many of them are also chronically ill, but this is just not something anyone is ever upset about. They're like, oh, if we have an off camera session, I can go for a walk or like I can meet you from my bed. That sounds great. Um, but yeah, so I do let people know these things ahead of time. I let them know, like, hey, I have connective tissue issues. So I type notes. So, I want to be really explicit that if you see me typing, I'm jotting down some notes. I'm not emailing. I'm not chatting on the side and, G chat, nothing like that. So yeah, I really take the time to name these things. And then after naming these aspects of identity, I make sure to say, like, do you have any thoughts or concerns that might impact us working together or our therapeutic relationship? Are there aspects of my disabled identity that pose a barrier to us working together? And that way people have the option to opt out if it doesn't work for them. There's no surprises.
I
So
think I think what we're speaking to, like the biggest theme really in everything we've talked about so far is around naming it. And when you name something, it just gives it this like um it gives it breath, it gives it freedom, it gives it we gives choice, and choice is one of the things that help us feel regulated, that help us feel at ease is having choice. And so even with, going back to like pain and naming body sensations or moving our body and in a safe environment where if you if you have pain during this movement in a yoga session with a qualified, professional, with your therapist, you can actually express that pain. It isn't go do this yoga class and like get through it and don't express the pain. The whole and then to express it and be validated and be seen, not just like, "Oh, you're always complaining." Like, "Yeah, I, I what do you mean? Like, honestly, I complain all the time and like it doesn't do any good." And I'm like, "That's not and we're not one, that's fine. And two, like, I'm not saying to just come to therapy and we're gonna complain. Like, it's about venting and getting validation in that and being seen accurately. So that's a lot of what my work will look like.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think, this is why we both like to talk about systems of oppression that impact folks, like naming the pathology of the system that often gets localized and create and socially constructed as the pathology of the individual. And so I'm very explicit about naming ableism, the ways that internalized ableism can show up, naming how fat phobia can show up, how it's so deeply rooted in racism. And I talk about this with my like clients a lot because I like to talk with them about proximity to power and how thinness got equated with power and status and social symbol in part because it is equated with white bodies. It is normed around white bodies. And it's a really interesting conversation when you start to have folks just like poke some holes in these systems that they've so deeply internalized within themselves. And I think like that piece of zooming out to then localize it back into a specific individual's experience is really, really powerful too. I know Nikki does that work a lot as well.
Yeah, I love to bring in some sins and ballads, some disability justice. Like, yo, society is only built for a limited range of minds and bodies. And, this is not about your illness, right? Like if our access needs were just met, right? Like disability doesn't exist in the same way. Doesn't mean that you don't have an impairment, but like if I think about back to like at the height of the pandemic when, overnight everything switched to Zoom. I was in grad school at that time, and because my access needs were just met, like that was a choice whether to disclose disability. I didn't have to because I could work from home. There was flexibility around like assignments being turned in, contract grading, all these accommodations that were being offered because of the collective trauma we were all living in. Um, and I think it can be really humanizing to be able to point to something and say, like, that actually sounds like your internalized ableism showing up. Like, this doesn't sound like a deficit in you. This doesn't sound like a problem with you. This sounds like some stuff you've internalized.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I agree. I also found such a breath of fresh air when all of the COVID lockdowns were happening. And I know that that's a tricky thing to talk about out loud, but yeah, like not having to drive, not having to I ended up getting a job in person during the pandemic and driving 35 minutes across Atlanta. Atlanta traffic is just horrible. But there was no traffic and I remember thinking like, what happened? Like I used to have such anxiety driving. What happened to my anxiety? Like this is amazing. I can drive 35 minutes, no problem. And then the world started coming back. And I was like, "Oh, right, right. It's still here. It's just I was accommodated during that time." So it yeah, I think that COVID in a lot of ways, yeah, there's a whole tangent I could go on about like what the new norm is after it was so a lot of people are trying to go back to old norms, but there is this new norm, and then there's a lot of rigidity that's happening around, oh, like, customers accepted that we just said no during the pandemic, so we can just keep saying no now, and that's kind of something that's happening as we're trying to go back. I'm wondering if you either of you can speak to this idea of, like, trying to go back to something after everything has changed, because I think that that's what a lot of my clients try to do after they get their diagnosis. I know I certainly did too. Like, we're trying to go back to something, but this new stuff is all here, whether we look at it or don't.
Yeah. You know, I tend to gently press into this over time because what I hear there is an avoidance of the experience of grief. And it makes so much sense. Again, grief is connected to sadness and it can feel really uncomfy, and we tend to want to get away from it. What I tend to do is talk about their experiences of loss and grief and how they've been socialized within their family or society to experience that grief or loss. I do some psychoeducation around the concepts of ambiguous loss and how we don't have customs for honoring these type of losses, and so they can honestly feel the hardest to sit with. I think going back to our conversation before, group work can be so powerful because you're sitting with folks who are also experiencing ambiguous grief and loss, and so you're validated around that experience, and how there isn't a trajectory for it. Um, And I love to sit too in the knowledge that kind of challenging the idea that disability means a deficit and exploring into what have they learned, holding the both and, so not engaging in toxic positivity around this, but what have they learned? What have they gained access to? If it's been community or other folks that they've connected with. A lot of my folks turn to online spaces for sources of friendship and connection because it is more accessible. Some of my folks, especially in both the queer and chronically ill community, have developed an acute sense of social justice as a result of what they're witnessing and attacks on their community or a lack of acknowledgement on their community. And it's so beautiful to see. I talk a lot about spirituality as being like that at the core, it's a connection to something bigger than yourself. And how when we move through grief, we also open up and get access to something even bigger and even greater potentially. And that's something that both like instills the hope and holds that both and the dialectic of it. Yeah. What are your thoughts, Nikki?
You kind of touched on them where my head went initially was grief as well. Um, how have folks grieved the loss of the old you, the former self? We actually just in my newer group that I'm running, we just had this conversation around grief, and I posed that question: How have you grieved the loss of the old you? And it was silence. And I gave it some time because the group is still kind of like forming and norming. So I was like, maybe this is vulnerable, but like, time stretched on into eternity. And I was like, and so I was like, I'm getting the sense from these crickets here that like maybe folks haven't. And then people started talking. No, I haven't grieved the loss of my old me. I'm not ready to do that yet. Like maybe I'm still in the denial stage. And so I think part of it is just also honoring that, like, you're talking a lot about how obviously the grieving process is not linear, but I don't know if there's science on this, but it feels to me like the process is long. The process is long with disability, and really normalizing that, and normalizing every stage of the process. I wish I could remember who wrote this article. So I apologize for not being able to give credit where credit's due, but I stumbled across an article. It was something along the lines of like the sixth stage of grief, meaning making. And I loved that. I had a whole like group session just on that. How do we make meaning from this experience? What does legacy and contribution look like? Like, how does helping others contribute to your sense of meaning? Like, just mindset shifts, things like that. Um, but it's a process. I've got to say, like, my longer running group that's been running for about a year, we just did radical acceptance like a year in. That's how long it took before I felt like folks would be ready to receive this.
Yeah, I have one more thought connected to that. I tend to find that folks have idealized their prior self, but when we explore into that, we find that their prior self likely was engaged in hyper productivity. And the components of internalized capitalism led them to believe that what they created through work, what they could produce, was their meaning, worth, and value. And how when we are no longer able to, it actually forces us to expand our identity. A lot of us have to take time off from work. And I remember when I did, how disoriented that was, because I realized even as I was talking about these things that I didn't really know who I was without that. And so I had to expand and breathe into that in a really powerful and profound way. And so for a lot of my folks, the shifting relationship with work becomes something that is a result of their chronic illness, and then gives so much opportunity for self-understanding and self-love. And so that part's really cool. I think a lot about care work, dreaming disability justice, that's a resource that I share a lot, and we'll make sure to Destiny to share the resources that we're talking about, so folks can take a look at them. But it's also understanding that someone with a disability has so much to offer, obviously, and shifting that narrative. Oh, this is a person that needs care, to bi-directional caregiving in the knowledge and wisdom and understanding that folks with disability have innately, having had to navigate these systems, to everything else that they already understand, that our worth is not just what we create. And I love to ask the question because similarly, it is crickets, but it tends to be so powerful. What if you were enough just as you were? I love to talk with folks about like this idea, like how wild would it be if we really thought that a squirrel every day when they woke up, they got out of their little like tree and they were like, I have to collect 30 nuts in order to be able to sleep in this tree tonight. Otherwise, my family's not going to love me. Otherwise, no one's going to respect me. I have to collect these nuts. We are the only beings on the planet that have to justify our existence through our productivity, and really interrogating what 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 do we wanna do with that?
That is a phenomenal analogy. That is so good. Especially because what came to mind was there are seasons and times where that squirrel does have to grind for their survival, and that is totally fine, but we don't have to grind 24/7 all day, every day. They're not they're not squirreling away their nuts because they're, trying to prove their worth. They're squirreling it away to eat throughout the winter, and that's it. So once that's done, then they're done. There's nothing more to prove. What else comes to mind around, we were really talking about, again, feeling seen, feeling heard, and I know we talk about this I talk about this almost every episode, but it's there's so much to talk about. There's so many pieces here. I heard us talking about strengths-based, and so strengths-based, like, theory, acceptance work, attachment work, which we've kind of, like, I haven't talked a whole lot about, but is weaved through here as well because just feeling seen, feeling heard, like that only works in the presence of someone that you're safely attached to. And that's why therapy can take so long. I think sometimes I get really caught up in like, if things are taking long, maybe I'm not doing a good enough job. But then I remember how many different pieces are here and everyone's in a different place and needs different things. And then for their nervous system to trust what it is we are offering can take time in and of itself. And that's why this stuff takes so long sometimes.
Absolutely. And one thing I think a lot about, for folks who are listening and clinicians who are able-bodied or maybe not experiencing chronic pain or chronic illness is the importance of naming that in the therapeutic space. I've heard a lot from clients who I've started working with after they've transitioned to another therapist, just said, I had named it in the beginning, but it never came up again in the therapeutic space. And we talk a lot about other realms that you can experience trauma. And the medical setting is something that is so rife with that, especially when we're talking about folks with intersectional identities and the capacity really for your identity to be ignored. I've had clients who are misgendered in a medical setting and don't feel like they have the space because it is so hierarchical to say, hey, those aren't my pronouns, or to be denied medical care, being told that they need to lose weight when the source of their disability also prevents them from movement that then they're being told that they have to do in order to get this treatment that really could profoundly change their life. Like that connection between weight and health is so profoundly and inextricably linked for many providers in a way that actually prevents access to care. And those pieces, again, because they're ongoing and the trauma doesn't just stop, it's generally not just one time with one provider. It also speaks to why therapeutic work can take so long, or having a space where you have this corrective experience, to your point, when you're working with a provider that might be invalidating this aspect of you, and then being able to go into the therapeutic space and not just have it acknowledged, but have it celebrated, that corrective experience becomes really important for combating other systems of oppression. It's not the only way, but I find with my spoonies, my chronically ill folks, that that becomes such an important aspect of our care.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah,
Is
I
there
think
Go ahead, Nikki.
sorry. Um, Thinking a lot too just about the agency that clients have to assess for disability affirming clinicians. The questions that we are allowed to ask, right? Like we are allowed to ask, how familiar are you with medical trauma? We're allowed to ask, can you talk to me about your experience working with disabled people? Um, how do you incorporate a disability affirming lens into your therapeutic approach? I think a really telling one would be to ask, like, how COVID conscious are you? What COVID precautions, if any, are you taking? Right? Like, that can suss out if, you're in the presence of somebody who believes COVID is over, which obviously is going to be really harmful to someone who's immunocompromised. If you have an intersectional identity, like how do you address the intersection of queer and disabled identities, right? Like, what is your understanding of disability justice or internalized ableism or medical gaslighting, right? Like, we can ask these questions. And if your potential provider cannot answer them, like that's a pretty good indicator that like this is probably not the person for you.
Yeah, I think, to that point, when you have your consult call with a therapist, yes, we ask these questions and there's no like one right answer. It's more about the answer that resonates with you. And also remembering it does take time to build trust, but you definitely shouldn't feel like there's red flags. Like you might not get the 100% green flag all the time simply because the therapist might not know exactly why you're asking this or what you're not why, but like um I've had some questions on consult calls where I'm like, I can tell you're trying to suss something out, but I can't exactly tell like let's get to know each other and we can come back to this question again, but it shouldn't be like a defensiveness or it shouldn't be a flat out like, well, what do you mean COVID's over or whatever? It shouldn't be like a big red flag. Um yeah, and it's hard because like the population that we're working with has experienced so much medical gaslighting and trauma with their providers. And so there is a bit of like there can be like a I need to make sure this person is right for me before we get started, which is fair because we don't need any more trauma. And also sometimes it just still does. I want to just like make sure people know it does still sometimes take time to figure out if your therapist is right for you or not. But it shouldn't like you shouldn't be leaving each session feeling like, man, I really didn't like this. I feel this way. I feel bad, but let me give it more time. Let me give it more time. Like it's very tricky. It's tricky.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as therapists on the other side, we need more folks who are skilled at working within these populations. And so it is on us to seek education, and we can do that, right? Like it is also okay to recognize where we still have areas of growth. And there are so many resources out there. And it doesn't just have to be that you've had a parallel experience. And sometimes folks want folks who have not had that experience, right? And you don't have to be for everyone, but you can also grow in this. And I've grown so much in my language and how I talk about this, both through trainings, but also through clinical work. And I kind of happened and started working with folks who had chronic illness and chronic pain when I was working in refugee resettlement with folks who had experienced horrific trauma. And then in my own trajectory, I started experiencing chronic pain and chronic illness. And so it doesn't have to be that you have a parallel experience. And there's so much wealth and of wisdom out there in the world that you can get even still. And I think like that's an important piece that we're not saying like you can't do if you don't yet know everything. And have folks that I work with who have diagnoses that I wasn't familiar with. I go and I educate myself to the greatest extent possible, while also sitting in the uniqueness of their experience. So they're not always having to tell me. And this is something I learned in refugee resettlement work too, of like trying to understand the context from which people were forcibly displaced. So they're not having to educate me every single session, keeping up with what is going on in the country of origin of the folks I work with. So they're not having to tell me when something big happens. It is also about continuing our education, understanding best practices, and growing so that we can do this work, but it doesn't have to be perfect.
Yeah, and I think we've talked a lot about how it can be an asset to have shared identity and to have parallel process, but I also think it can be really healing the other way around to actually work with an able-bodied therapist who has actually done the work, who can provide like a radical healing experience maybe for the first time ever out of a person's out of all of their providers. Like that can instill hope. That can be really healing to actually have that experience. So I do think that there's a lot um words, help me out, Samantha.
Of
A lot can be
richness.
gained. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's a good
well,
point right
yeah,
there.
to what you're saying is, to have somebody who doesn't have a chronic illness and they can attune to you or keep up with understanding what's happening in the chronic pain world to as much as they can. Yeah, because other people in your life who don't understand you often typically don't have your experience. So then you just think like, well, you can only understand if you've been in my body, which to a certain extent is, I can only you can understand your experience. But then to that point is like the therapist who's chronically ill also can't, they can understand their experience. They can understand what it's like to live with a chronic illness. And then you can easily be like, oh, well, you only understand because you have a chronic illness. But to be attuned to by someone who doesn't have that same lived experience is it's so healing. And I do, for people listening, both therapists and non-therapists, there is now a directory on the website. Y'all are welcome to join it. And if you're looking for a therapist who has lived experience or just has specialty in this area, you can go to the chronicillness-therapist.com/directory and find somebody there.
Awesome. Yeah. And I don't think that we specified where our practice is located. We are both licensed in Illinois, and our practice is located in Chicago in the Loop. So, for folks in the area, we do have clinicians that do in person work. A lot of us do virtual and/or hybrid work as well. And the same with our yoga studio. And I don't know if Nikki wants to put in a plug for the groups that they're doing, but that maybe could be a helpful resource as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I run two sections of my Spoonies Unite support space. One is on Wednesdays from 5:30 to 6:45. And the other is on Fridays from 4 o'clock to 5:15, both virtual and open to anyone in the state of Illinois. So if you're listening and you're in Illinois and this could be a benefit for you, you can find me through our website at roomtobreathechicago.com. Is that what it is, Samantha?
Exactly. Yeah.
roomtobreathechicago.com. And I'm Nikki, Niki, at roomtobreathechicago.com. Yeah, and if enough of you reach out to me, maybe I'll be forced to start a third group. So, just reach out.
Yes. Yeah. Any last words that you want to share or kind of leave people with today as we end?
That's a really good question. One of the resources that has been really healing for me is Andrea Gibson's work. They're an incredibly talented poet, and they have had chronic mental health concerns. They have chronic illness, ostensibly a terminal illness that they're contending with. And the way that they write about this duality is both the grief and the beauty and the hope and freedom and the loss and the pain. Having someone share that through art is incredibly powerful. Like, I always say therapy is one therapeutic tool, but there are so many others, and art is such a powerful form of healing and being witnessed in that way. I found myself coming back to Andrea's work a lot in the group that I was doing, and it provided so much richness and conversation and reflection. So both for folks who are looking for therapeutic um, resources on their own, or for folks who are wanting to share this with their clients, their work is just so powerful.
A resource that's been really helpful for me is the book The Invisible Kingdom, Reimagining Chronic Illness by Megan O'Rourke. I think she does such a fascinating job really humanizing these really poorly understood autoimmune conditions, of which she has several. She talks a lot about long COVID. And so I think anybody navigating something that's poorly understood, I think could get a lot of benefit from this book that is just really deeply humanizing.
Amazing. Those sound like really great resources. So thank you for sharing them. I will definitely link them in the show notes below. And yeah, people can find you at roomtobreathechicago.com if they are living in the state of Illinois. And thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Jess.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you learned something new today, consider writing it down in your phone notes or journal and make that new neural pathway light up. Better yet, I'd love to hear from you. Send me a DM on Instagram, email me, or leave a voice memo for us to play on the next show. The way you summarize your takeaways can be the perfect little soundbite that someone else might need. And lastly, leaving a review really helps others find this podcast, so please do if you found this episode helpful. And P.S., clicking subscribe ensures you'll be here for the next episode. See you then!